She was supposed to become the wife of Richard the Lionheart and the Queen of England. Instead, she may have been seduced by her own father-in-law, imprisoned by the Plantagenets, and left with a reputation destroyed by one of the darkest scandals of the Middle Ages. In today's video, I will tell you the tragic story of Alys, Countess of the Vexin, and together we will try to uncover what really happened and who destroyed the life of this young French princess. Leave a like, and let's dive into the dirtiest secrets in history. Before I begin telling you the story of Alys and her fate, we need to rewind history by several decades to a time before she was even born, because this story is a bit like a television series. If you have not watched the first season, you are unlikely to understand what is happening in the second. To better immerse yourself in what people today would call the lore of this story, I recommend watching my video about Eleanor of Aquitaine. Because, strictly speaking, Alys came into this world precisely because of the failed marriage between Eleanor of Aquitaine and the father of today's heroine, King Louis VII of France. The problem was that this royal couple not only had what we would now call incompatible personalities, but during 15 years of marriage, they also failed to produce a male heir. They had only 2 daughters, and so their marriage was annulled. As is often the case with former spouses, an unspoken competition then began over who could rebuild their life more quickly and successfully after the divorce. And Eleanor was definitely the first to pull ahead. Just 6 weeks later, she married a claimant to the English throne, the future King Henry II, provoking the incredible anger of Louis, who apparently still believed that Eleanor's lands, as well as Eleanor herself, belonged to him. But not only did Eleanor rebuild her life with astonishing speed, she also began giving her new husband one son after another, practically every year, which I imagine wounded the French king's ego at least a little more. Louis therefore hurried to marry Constance of Castile, the mother of our Alys, hoping that she would finally give him sons as well. But once again, only daughters were born to the royal couple Margaret and Alys, and Constance died while giving birth to the latter. And it was through this tragic accident that the exact date of our heroine's birth was preserved, October 4th, 1160. As you may remember from my previous videos, the birth dates of princesses were not usually recorded in the 12th century, but in the case of Alys, we know hers thanks to this tragic combination of circumstances. But while we know the exact date of her birth, the correct pronunciation of her name remains something of a mystery. Chroniclers of the time referred to her as Alys, Alex, Alys, and even Adele, but in modern retellings she is often called Alys, and that is the version of her name I will use. Unfortunately, not a single image of Alys has survived either, so all the depictions I use in this video will be purely illustrative, with the exception of those showing the men who lived at the same time as her. Once again, this has everything to do with the position of women in the Middle Ages. When Alys was only 5 weeks old, she acquired a stepmother because her father married for the 3rd time, and after a while, on his 3rd attempt, the family finally welcomed a male heir named Philip. When Alys was only 9 years old, England and France concluded the Treaty of Montmirail, which ultimately determined her fate. Alys was to become the wife of Prince Richard, who would one day become famous as Richard the Lionheart. At that point, however, he was still far from achieving such greatness. Richard was not the heir to the throne, but merely the 3rd son, although he was Eleanor's favourite. He had 2 older brothers, both of whom also had brides, and could eventually produce heirs of their own. So no one seriously imagined that Alys might one day become queen, and she was probably expected to live a fairly ordinary life at the English court. At the time, it was common practice for princesses to be sent away and raised at the court of their future husbands, supposedly so that the couple could get to know one another better before marriage. Alys's older sister Margaret, who had been married to Henry the young king, one of the sons of Henry and Eleanor, had already been living and growing up in England since the age of 3. And so Alys also left France and was sent to England. It is impossible to know how well this plan actually worked, or whether Alys ever managed to get to know her future husband properly. But time passed, the girl grew older, and the promised wedding still did not take place. Alice's sister had begun living with her husband at the age of 14, while Alys had long since crossed that threshold, and the dirtiest and wildest rumours began spreading across Europe. The problem was that Henry II, despite being married to Eleanor, one of the most brilliant and beautiful women of her time, was clearly incapable of remaining faithful. He became notorious for having numerous mistresses. Henry was so shameless that he even allowed the illegitimate children born from these women to live at court and raise them alongside his own legitimate children. Eleanor could not tolerate such humiliation, and she encouraged her sons, who were also unhappy with their position at their father's court, to rebel against her husband. The rebellion failed and ended with Eleanor being imprisoned. And because so many people already believed in the king's lustful reputation, they began saying that the real reason for the delay was that Henry had seduced his own future daughter-in-law. According to some versions, he was planning to marry her himself after ending his marriage to Eleanor. Even the king's own chaplain, Gerald de Barry, who was considered one of the greatest gossips of his time, claimed that Alys had given birth to a son by the king, or perhaps even several children. You have to admit, Santa Barbara looks almost innocent compared with what was supposedly happening behind the walls of these castles. Naturally, these rumours eventually reached Alice's family as well. Louis was hardly pleased by the thought that the man who had once shared a bed with his former wife might now also be sharing one with his daughter. But Henry assured the French king that the only problem was the dowry, and that the wedding would take place any day now. The scandal went so far that, in 1177, the Pope threatened King Henry with an interdict unless he finally arranged the marriage between Alys and Richard. An interdict was an even harsher punishment than excommunication, because it no longer affected only the king, but all the people living on his lands. And as you may remember, for a medieval person, this was practically the highest possible form of punishment. But once again, the wedding never took place. For the next 12 years, right up until Henry's death in 1189, Alys remained unmarried, even though by that point she was already 29 years old, and by the standards of the time, could easily have had grandchildren of her own. During those years, the situation surrounding the succession also changed considerably. Richard's two older brothers died, clearing his path to the throne, and so Alys, whose engagement was still formally in place, could now reasonably expect that she would one day become Queen Alys of England. But after becoming king, Richard did not rush to the altar with Alys. The young woman remained in a suspended state until Richard finally met with her brother to decide what was to be done with her. Roger of Howden, an English chronicler who had served at both Henry's and Richard's courts, wrote that when the French king asked Richard why he refused to marry his sister, Richard replied that he would on no account whatever take his sister to wife. Inasmuch as the King of England, his own father, had been intimate with her, and had had a son by her, Philip did not believe this story and thought that Richard was simply looking for an excuse not to marry her. Whether this story was true, and whether Richard really said these words, we simply do not know. It is entirely possible that the account was recorded for the sole purpose of compromising the young woman. But, in any case, Roger and the later chroniclers who repeated this story again and again ultimately destroyed Alys's reputation in history, just as her reputation as a woman had already been destroyed during her lifetime. And so, after spending almost 21 years in England in the position of a bride, Alys suddenly found herself rejected and no longer needed by anyone. Philip wanted her to marry Prince John, Richard's younger brother, whom you probably know better as John Lackland. But both Eleanor and Richard prevented this marriage from taking place. The partnership between Philip and John would have been a ticking time bomb, especially since John would later make more than one attempt to steal the throne from his elder brother. So, this union was never allowed to happen. In the end, as compensation for all the inconvenience, Richard paid Philip 10,000 marks, while he himself married Berengaria of Navarre, whom he had apparently met several years earlier, and with whom he probably shared a mutual attraction. But if you think that now, once the English no longer needed Alys, she was simply allowed to return home, just as her sister had once done after the death of Henry the young king, then you would be mistaken. The Plantagenet family was in no hurry to release the bride who had never become one of them, and Alys spent almost 5 years confined in the Norman city of Rouen. In August 1195, after several attempts by her brother Philip to besiege Rouen and free her, Richard finally ordered that Alys be released and returned to her homeland. By that point, she was already 35 years old. By the standards of the time, she was considered a hopeless old maid, and naturally, no one could seriously speak of arranging some new and promising marriage for her. Philip, nevertheless, began searching for a husband for his sister among the few possible candidates, and the man who agreed to this rather risky arrangement was William IV, Count of Ponthieu, the ruler of a small province in northern France. He was 17 years younger than his bride, which was, of course, a truly shocking age difference for that period. But the bride's generous dowry and the opportunity to marry into the royal family apparently played their part. One way or another, on August 20th, 1195, Alys finally became a wife. In fact, Philip had hoped that because Alys was already considered too old, she would never have children with William, and that after her death, all of her wealth would eventually return to the French crown. But Alys surprised everyone. She gave birth to 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, even though she was already approaching 40. Of those children, however, only one daughter, Marie, survived into adulthood. We know very little about the final years of Alys's life. She was forgotten once again, just as she had been for most of her not particularly happy existence. And although we know the exact date of her birth, the date of her death remains a mystery. She probably died when she was around 60 years old, sometime in the early 13th century. Although Alys herself never became Queen of England, one of those curious twists of medieval genealogy and marriage meant that one of her descendants eventually did. Marie's eldest daughter, Joan, married the King of Castile in 1237. Her eldest daughter, Eleanor, married the future King Edward I and later became Queen of England. So, even if only through her great-granddaughter, Alys's fate was ultimately tied to the English crown. Alys of France is a tragic figure, no matter which version of her story you choose to believe. Whether she was seduced by a man almost 30 years older than her or not, her life was still broken. Her reputation was blackened, and the best years of her life were spent in an endless and humiliating state of waiting. Thanks to the film The Lion in Winter, Alys briefly returned to the surface and people remembered her story again. But I cannot shake the thought that had the Plantagenets not stolen her fate from her, she might have lived a far better life and been remembered for much more than just a scandal. But what do you think really happened? Was Alys the victim of an aging king, or the victim of vicious gossip? Share your opinion in the comments, and I will see you in the next video.